The study of art really had a completely new existence in the 19th century and really after the 20th century and the beginnings of anthropology, because for the most part, there was not much interest in things that were happening outside of Europe during that time. The European experts and people who had any kind of interest in art really were only focused on the art that was made by themselves, by the people that they understood and the aesthetic sense that they were resonating with. This book here, which is the first book of art history, at least the one that we can record in our understanding, by Franz Kugler, is pointing out to the beginning of art history with Alexander von Humboldt a few years earlier. We'll get back to what that means in a second, but his number one contribution to the art world at the time was to divide world art history into four periods. Roughly speaking, the pre-Hellenic period, so before the Greeks, and then classical period, Greek and Roman antiquity, then the Romantic period with the medieval era, and eventually the modern era from the Renaissance onward to the 19th century when he is writing. Kugler at the time was mostly working for the German or the Prussian government. He was not directly involved in scientific research, mostly because that did not bring any money and that did not allow him to do any kind of research. So he kind of just started his work of writing a history of art on his own, because that was the only way that he could have had access to those that kind of his activity in a way. So this particular article excerpt here says, only since the beginning of the new century, since Alexander von Humboldt carried the light of today's science to the countries of the New World, has one turned to the study of American antiquity anew. Because the number one new revelation in the history of the world and the history of art was the American form of art at the time. Now, there was some understanding of what was happening in Asia and the Middle East, but those things were generally considered to be the remnants of a distant past. Once the Americas are rediscovered by Europeans and their forms of architecture, their forms of sculpture, their forms of painting are rediscovered, then there is a completely new player, if you will, in the artistic enterprise of the world. Now, he is quoting, like I said, Alexander von Humboldt, the brother of Wilhelm von Humboldt that we have mentioned before in this class. Humboldt was an intellectual, kind of very well-rounded, kind of like his brother, a geographer, a scientist writ large, and eventually he began the study of botanical geography, which is essentially looking at plants and how plants got to be the way that they are, the way that they look, how pretty they are, etc. And his contribution to science as a whole was really to look at that geographical understanding to really make sense of how the world is working as a single place, essentially somewhat of the beginnings of ecological research as we understand it today. But his study of art, especially American art, goes through these very careful reproductions of what he was seeing when he traveled to the Americas in the early 19th centuries. This here, the book, so Humboldt was German, but the book was published in France, and the subtitle here, or the caption of these engravings is the bust of a Aztec priestess. And so he found part of Aztec sculptures and tried to reproduce it very carefully so that people would have some kind of an idea of what those things he saw look like. This is the early 19th century, and the approach or the access to modern technology, photography and the such, was just not existent. So his best shot at conveying his idea, or at showing people how things worked in another part of the world, was to draw it. Now, photography as we know it would be invented only a few years later, at least in a very rudimentary form, and afterwards the practice would be more general. But this is an important step, and especially for us today, which we have Google to find pictures of pretty much everything. This is a very important change that has happened for all of us in the context of being able to see and consider and imagine other people's lives during that time, or imagine different places, especially because von Humboldt, being a scientist, had a very clear goal and a very clear method to what he was doing, which was not necessarily the case for everyone at the time. Nevertheless, von Humboldt was also very concerned with the forms of art that he was seeing as a form of history, perhaps separate from the larger context of art that we would typically think of. And this is something that we have mentioned before previously. It's something that I like to hammer on quite a bit in my classes in general, is the fact that in those early years of science, there was very much this idea that people outside of Europe were just not smart, not able to really understand things on the level that we do today. And even Franz Kugler on the previous slide was thinking of those non-European forms of art as kind of the childhood of human culture and kind of as the drawings of a child in a variety of ways. Now, von Humboldt, by those new pictures that he found, proves that this is not quite as simple as it may seem. This is not rudimentary art that he was seeing. This is a very complete, very detailed form of art, and for him to provide detailed account of the detailed form of art that he found was very much new for a lot of people. But that's not to say that von Humboldt did not have his own shortcomings or his own misgivings about those people that he saw. On the other hand, he says monuments produced by peoples who did not attain a high level of intellectual culture, or who, for either religious or political reasons or because of the nature of their social organization, seemed less appreciated of the beauty of forms, can only be considered historical monuments. To this category belong the sculptural relics scattered throughout the vast land stretching from the banks of the Euphrates to the eastern coast of Asia, the idols of Tibet and Hindustan, and those found on the central plateau of Mongolia attract our attention because they shed light upon the ancient contacts between peoples and the common origin of their mythological traditions. So, even Egyptian pyramids, even some of those ancient forms of art that would have otherwise been impressive to most people, von Humboldt classified as essentially a historical value, much more than an artistic value. It was seen as not so important, however monumental it might have been. And so there is quite a bit of talk around all of this because this is a pretty lengthy form of work that he pointed out, but for all of its of all of its problems, there are also I don't think this slide was supposed to be in here. That's okay though. There was also alternative, if you will, alternative facts that existed in this ancient form of science. These pictures here are these drawings represented by Jean-Frédéric Maximilien Waldeck, a European question mark, traveler, strange person in a variety of ways. There's no evidence of exactly where he was born. There's not much traces of his early life for the most part. What we have, though, is a pretty detailed account of a few years that he spent in Mexico in the early 19th century, where he found a Maya or Mexican waitress mistress, and kind of just set camp in an old Maya temple and started to draw it. Although not draw it exactly as he saw it, he started to draw these Mayan temples the way that he imagined, or the way that he saw the Arabian temples before him and the Egyptian temples before him, because his great idea, just like many other people at this time, was that the Mexican indigenous tribes were one of the lost tribes of Israel. And so, therefore, his view was that, of course, the Mexican indigenous people had created these monumental architecture, but they created it only because they were the descendants of the Egyptians as a result of that. So you have these very ornamental forms of arches, and we'll see in a second, that are not true to form, and kind of become part of the vernacular of the way that things were working out in Europe at the time. So again, if you had access to a book or some kind of literature of some sort, you might equally come across the representations given by Humboldt and the representation given by Waldeck, only one of which is very is accurate and scientific or representative. And that is probably one of the biggest problem that we are talking about art here, is that art being kind of an interpretive process can be interpreted in a variety of ways. And this particular drawing here, which is a high quality drawing, is also not true to form, as opposed to the high quality drawings created by another person that are also true to form, which today, we would certainly make a difference between art and science because we know that those two things are not quite the same. Nevertheless, back then, most science was really a matter of art before the development of the scientific method, as we have talked about before. This here representation by Frederick Catherwood is a painting of what the Maya ruins looked like when he visited Central America in Yucatan and Chiapas. That was also in the early 19th century. And he had beforehand also visited Egyptian pyramids and Phoenician sites in the Middle East. And so he saw firsthand what those things looked like. And then when he traveled to Mexico, he saw firsthand what the temples looked like there and knew that quite obviously those were not the product of the same cultures. Those were two different people who created two different types of architecture. So having his own view of these temples is another counterpoint to the of drawings that Waldeck provided. Now, again, we have some idea that these drawings that Catherwood gave us are mostly accurate because we have some of those relics left to us. In other words, now today we could look at a picture of Palenque, the palace at Palenque, which is what this particular drawing represents here, and see that obviously it looks like this particular form of arch rather than this particular form of arch, which again would look more like a Arabian style of temple that you would see somewhere else in the world. But without the technology, without the faithful technology that digital practices allow us to figure, we are still kind of hooked on to these human representations of other ideas. And it is important to keep in mind that however smart people might have been 200 years ago, they also might not have had the best designs or intentions or even goals than most of us would have today. Which leads us to Franz Boas, who also studied art, eventually looking at indigenous art in North America in the 20th century, who tried to gather a bunch of ideas that existing during this time about art and the interpretation of art. We have therefore at the present time three distinct theories regarding the development of decorative design. First, the theory of realistic origin of conventional motives. Second, that of the technical origin of conventional motives. And third, the theory that the explanations of conventional motives are essentially secondary in character and due to a later association of the existing decorative forms with realistic forms. Boas's number one concern was trying to understand why some cultures had very similar forms of art while other cultures have very different forms of art, and lots of people had tried their hands at giving those explanations, as he mentions here. Some people thought that humans, in their art history have only ever been trying to replicate reality, and so when they found a particularly good branch that they could use as a club, then from that point on, they tried to replicate the club by finding the right branch that looks like a club. Otherwise, the second technical origin, which is that people found the tools that allowed them to create the art like they wanted to. And so they had to develop the technology that allowed them to develop their technology, kind of, not necessarily inspired by nature. And the third theory, that the explanations of conventional motives are essentially secondary in character to the decorative forms, is that people might have an aesthetic sense of how things look and what things look good or bad. And in the sense that Waldeck was representing the Mexican temples as a form of Arabian culture, this is part of his own aesthetic sense of what a temple should look like or could look like, and kind of what inspired him. In that context, the actual shape, the actual design behind what he saw was really secondary. And this is what Boaz touches on in this particular slide.